Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This is one way in which I resemble Milton Friedman. We'll just say I'm under 6 feet tall, somewhere in the vicinity of under 6 feet. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be here. I'm very, very pleased to be speaking at an ISI function. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute is one of the remaining bastions of civilization in this world, I truly believe, and it's a great honor to speak here. And it's also something quite rare for me to be speaking so far from home at a time like this, because the past few months I've been speaking primarily somewhere in the vicinity of my home in New York. I've spoken in New York, or speak in Connecticut, New Jersey, because my wife is expecting our third child next month, and so I don't want to leave her alone. We got 2 other little children overnight, so ISI is a rare exception to that, but I'm flying out here, I'm speaking to you, spending some time with you, and then tonight fly back, because my wife is a saint I in no way deserve, and I don't want to take undue advantage of her. I saw recently an old friend who is an economist from Germany living in the United States, and he was saying to me, I see you have a new book out, and I said, well, yes, but we have other good news as well. We have a new baby on the way. And I joked that it seemed like I was doing like 1 book per baby or 1 baby per book or something. And he looked at me quite solemnly and said, well, I don't think you can keep up that pace. And I walked away not exactly knowing if he meant books or babies. Exactly. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm following Dr. Skousen, who told the story about how he tore up a $20 bill of Milton Friedman's. I mean, I don't see how I threw a penny into that fountain outside. That's about it. I don't know. How am I supposed to follow up on that story? Thank you so much for that. That was the best story I've ever heard, basically. But beyond that, I hope, although we are here to honor Milton Friedman, you won't think me hopelessly vain if I begin with a brief note about myself, because it is relevant to my remarks today. It is true that I wrote this book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, but I've also had a couple of books since then, and the reason for that is that some publishers go much faster with your material than others do. Some of them sit on it for a while. Others of them, like Regnery Publishing, God bless Regnery Publishing. You submit something, they work on it intensely, and somehow 15 minutes later it's on the shelves. It's unbelievable. So it seemed as if this Woods character just puts out a book every 3-4 weeks or so, but I assure you I wrote them at different times, and it's just by a fluke of publishing schedules that they came out at the same time. So following that one, I also had a book called How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization. And then in between that one, I had a book called The Church and the Market, A Catholic Defense of the Free Economy. Now, my politically incorrect guide to American history was rather controversial, but of course controversy is never bad for sales. And the cover of that book, which was designed by Regnery, featured, it was Longstreet was on the cover, and it was very controversial. So I think some people may have thought that I was getting cold feet or something when they saw that my next book, The Church and the Market, looked like this. It was a completely black cover, but the reason for that is that Lexington Books does simultaneous paperbacks and hardcovers. And they were out of the paperback at the time that I contacted them. All they had was the hardcover. The hardcover is aimed at institutions, libraries, etc. And so normally they don't expect individuals to buy them. The hardcover, I kid you not, of The Church and the Market retails at $75. But today, for you folks, it's $20. Think of the arbitrage possibilities, people. You could quit your jobs, drop out of school, resell this book. By the way, I heard a story about a guy who bought 2 or 3 copies, and the next day he woke up and in his bed he was surrounded by precious gems. Now, I don't know if there's a causal relationship here. I'm told these results are not typical, but anyway, you might be worth noting. So it is out there on the ISI tables, the one book with no distinguishing characteristics on it. It's like the publishing equivalent of a brown paper bag, more or less. Well, in any event, although I'm a Catholic, and I write, therefore, a great deal about Catholic social teaching, the points I want to make today, I hope, can be heard with profit by people of other Christian denominations, other religions, or even no religion at all. If you read many expositions of Catholic and more broadly Christian social teaching, you find a lot of statements that go something like this. It is good for families to prosper. Therefore, the following principle is morally obligatory, and the following principle will be taxation on wealth, heavy regulation on business, and so forth. So in other words, we want X, the well-being of families, therefore we should have Y, heavy taxation on wealth or whatever. But what if, number one, Y moves you further away from X, or two, there are better ways than Y of getting X, or both? That is the line of argument that I'm pursuing in The Church and the Market and in my writing in this regard, is that, in other words, even from a Christian's own point of view, even on the basis of your own goals and your own moral beliefs, you should prefer the free market. So it's safe to assume, I think, that Catholics and others who call, for example, for a universal living wage, everyone should get a wage that is sufficient to allow him to prosper, allow the prosperity of his family, and so on. People who do this, I am sure, are not calling for a universal living wage because they secretly know that it will actually make people worse off. And they're just Machiavellians, and so they secretly want to make people worse off in this indirect way. I mean, I don't think so. I think they're just mistaken. They think we want people's wages to be higher. Well, let's just pass a law, make the wages higher. But in a certain way, that's sort of like saying, you know, I am sick and tired of falling off that cliff every time I step 1 foot off it. Let's just pass a law abolishing that law of gravity, and that ought to do that. Well, you can't really do that, is the problem. You can't do it in the physical world. You can't do it in economics. So what if I were to come back and say a universal living wage is actually simply going to increase unemployment and therefore make families much worse off because the head of the household will be unemployed? There's nothing, I argue in the book, in Catholic obedience that forbids me to point out what I think is this provable fact. Now, one proviso before I explain what this has to do with Milton Friedman. Whenever the subject of Catholic social teaching and the free market comes up, some people can always be counted on to point out that material prosperity isn't everything. That's the allegation that's thrown at market economists a lot, that all you people care about is economic efficiency. Don't you know there are other values in the world than efficiency? Oh, that's what you get told, right? You're morally obtuse. All you think that matters is material prosperity. But what I want to say on that front is, number one, no, I'm not saying that. But secondly, when the American bishops, for instance, issue one of their statements on the economy, their statements are geared toward improving people's material well-being. No American bishop's statement has ever said, we want to pursue justice, but unfortunately that's going to mean we have to increase unemployment, misery, and poverty. They always say we want to pursue justice and the material well-being of people. They assume that their economic policies will bring about material well-being. They don't say, well, workers, I'm sorry, you're in for some rough troubles ahead if our policies are instituted. They think that their policies will make people more materially prosperous. So they themselves believe believe that their policies will lead to material prosperity, and that's why they call for them. Monsignor John Ryan, for example, who worked in the early half of the first half of the 20th century, he was the American priest who probably more than any other really attempted to reckon with the question of labor and wages. And he said, these are his words, that men are more susceptible to religious influence and can know and serve God better when they are contented and comfortable than when they are impoverished and miserable. So his belief that the material well-being of workers would be increased by living wage legislation is what motivated his campaign on its behalf. But beyond that, I also want to suggest that there really isn't anything wrong with advocating policies that improve people's material well-being as long as those policies don't involve anything morally illicit. Because most people do want to improve their material well-being, and in most cases there's nothing morally problematic about this. Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist, said this: "The immense majority strives after a greater and better supply of food, clothes, homes, and other material amenities. In calling a rise in the masses' standard of living progress and improvement, economists do not espouse a mean materialism. They simply establish the fact that people are motivated by the urge to improve the material conditions of their existence. They judge policies from the point of view of the aims men want to attain." And then my favorite line of all, "He who disdains the fall in infant mortality and the gradual disappearance of famines and plagues may cast the first stone upon the materialism of the economists." I don't suppose we have any takers. Now, what has any of this to do with Milton Friedman, the man we are honoring today? Well, simply this: he has done important work, and anyone, religious or not, can stand to learn from him. Now, I come at this from an Austrian point of view, which is in a sense sort of the rival school to the Chicago people among free marketeers. But I came here in an ecumenical spirit today, not to bury Milton Friedman, but to praise him. And in particular, I want to point out some of his important work in matters of labor and wages that we see in a number of his works, particularly in the book Free to Choose, written with Rose Friedman. But let me begin by noting that at least the Catholic Church consistently has maintained, for the most part, has maintained that faith and reason are not in conflict with each other, but rather are two sources of a single truth. They cannot contradict each other. And the Church has consistently been eager to learn from the secular world in areas in which she herself lacks competence. Now, this has been true from antiquity to the present. We see, for example, that Clement of Alexandria insisted that the ancient Greeks should be taught at his great catechetical school. St. Justin Martyr spoke of the seeds of the Word to be found in the ancient Greeks. St. John of Damascus favored the study and use of what was good and valuable in Greek philosophy because he said, "Whatever there is of good has been given to men from above by God, since every best gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights." That has been the attitude of the Church. We can learn from the secular world. Now, if religious spokesmen want to weigh in on economic matters, they, like everyone else, must first know what they're talking about. And in many areas, Milton Friedman is the kind of person from whom they might learn. Now, it is altogether sensible for the Church to describe the ideal situation as one in which a working man earns a sufficient wage for the care of himself and his family. But any statement that goes beyond this and claims to indicate the most effective way to bring about this desirable outcome is removed from the levels of faith and morals. This is where you need to learn from the secular world. For example, it is perfectly legitimate for a churchman to say, I think in the field of architecture, we should build our churches so that they will last a long time, as befits the dignity of God, that they should be built in a way that reflects God's grandeur and dignity, that inspires human beings. So in other words, not the warehouses that people seem to want to build these days for churches, but we should build beautiful churches rather than repellent ones. That's fine. But if a churchman then went on to say, I also want to make the moral statement that it is morally proper that you should use the following building materials because they're the best, or you should use this or that technique. Well, there's no particular reason a churchman would be an expert on what the best technique is or what the best materials are. Well, likewise, what's the best economic policy to bring about the outcome we all desire? This is not something that a theologian per se necessarily knows. Now, I'd like to focus in particular on a section of Milton Friedman's work in his book that he wrote with Rose Friedman, Free to Choose. He has a section called Who Protects the Worker? And that's the area I'd like to focus on here. Because Archbishop John J. Myers, not long ago, emphasized the same point that I'm emphasizing. And I was shocked at this. I figured it's just me. I'm alone in the Catholic world trying to make these points. And here was this great archbishop. So I thought, I'm going to quote this for the rest of my life. The rest of his life and my life, and leave it to my children to keep quoting. Because Archbishop Myers said, look, no Catholic can say, and by extension any Christian, can say, I don't care about the poor. But there is legitimate difference of opinion on what is the best way to help the poor, through this type of program or through the free market and whatever, and he said that. And so I want to refer to Milton Friedman's work in this area to amplify that very important insight. Now, Friedman has this section, Who Protects the Worker? And he takes exactly the opposite view of what everyone is taught, what you're taught, I know from my own sad experience, what you're taught in every single American history textbook. Heaven help us with these American history textbooks, with very, very few exceptions. It's that if it weren't for government and labor unions, well, our children would all be working in mines, we'd all be working 100-hour weeks. Yeah, there are 100 hours in the week, right? Yeah, we'd be working 100-hour weeks. We'd all be eating dirt or worms or whatever. Like, this is the view that you get. And so, of course, when I have students who have this view, I don't blame them for it. I don't say they're just hopelessly ignorant or why do they refuse to learn. This is what they've been taught every single day of their lives. They've been taught this. I was taught this in junior high school. I mean, I had, as a history teacher in junior high school, unfortunately, and I'm being vague enough that no one will know exactly the person because let her live out the rest of her life. I don't want to ruin the poor woman, but she was pretty much one chapter ahead of the class, this sort of thing. And then the next year I had the track coach. I have nothing against track coaches, but he was about a half a chapter ahead of us. So, and the chapter said, everybody was suffering until you had labor unions, and then they were doing better. Therefore, unions caused the prosperity. Well, even if that were true, there's a logical fallacy involved there. There isn't necessarily a causal relationship. The good outcome might have happened very much in spite of union activity. I mean, you don't know that on the basis of history alone. You have to have economic theory to help you to navigate the thicket of historical events. Well, this tale, which is superficially plausible, is taken for granted now by basically all Americans. But it's not enough just simply to say that this tale is false. It is grotesquely false. It praises the very institutions that have held back American prosperity and unequivocally reduced the material well-being of the American population, and condemns the only forces that have consistently and of necessity raised the standard of living of all Americans. Now, to appreciate just how perverse this version of American economic history is, let me introduce to you the following thought experiment. Let us suppose that some catastrophe should occur today that very significantly lowers the productivity of American labor, that is, how much output a particular worker can produce. Let us suppose that all automobiles are destroyed, and with them the knowledge to create new ones. Our entire transportation system reverts to railroads and the horse and buggy. In addition, fax machines, standard and cellular telephones, email, and the internet all vanish, as do radio and television, and our communications infrastructure is reduced to the telegraph. Likewise, all other capital equipment invented and developed over the course of the past 150 years is wiped out. Many conveniences we take for granted no longer exist at all, and the vast majority of the remainder must be made either by hand or by what, from our point of view, are only the clumsiest and most inefficient machines. Needless to say, this economy is capable of far, far less production than it was before the catastrophe. Now, in the midst of this disaster, suppose a group of self-proclaimed advocates for the working class declared that even in these radically changed circumstances, people should continue to work 40 hours a week and no more, and that it should be unlawful to ask any worker to put in additional hours. We'll have the death penalty for any employer who asks for that. Now, what would be the result? Well, massive impoverishment, of course. Now, why is that? Well, let's say, for the sake of simplicity, that before this disaster, the American labor force, with everybody working an average of 40 hours a week, could produce 10 trillion consumer goods per year. I'm just choosing that at random. And that figure would include everything from apples and razors to automobiles, personal computers, and cell phones. But now imagine that same labor force working the same number of hours, but without the benefit of automobiles, telephones, or radio, to say nothing of personal computers, the internet, and cell phones. The fruits of a century of capital investment by business firms are likewise gone, and the labor force therefore lacks just about every modern invention that has improved and better coordinated the production process. American workers are reduced to producing all goods by hand or with the most primitive machines. Well, obviously, under these conditions, the labor force can produce only the tiniest fraction of the goods it once could, and is completely incapable of producing entire classes of goods, namely those involving 20th and 21st century technology. If they work with their bare hands, the same number of hours they did back when they had trillions of dollars of advanced capital and modern machinery to help them, they may produce, let's say, only 100 billion consumer goods, 1/100th of what they produced in the past. I think that's being generous. Per capita, therefore, everybody must now be satisfied with 1/100th of the things they used to enjoy. They will have to abandon entirely the purchase of entire categories of goods just in order to make sure they have enough for basic necessities. And in fact, under these conditions, people will have to be satisfied with the barest necessities if they can acquire even those. The goods they might have purchased and enjoyed in the past simply do not exist in the necessary quantities to satisfy everyone, if indeed they exist at all. The American labor force is no longer physically capable of producing them. So under these circumstances, therefore, what does common sense tell us? That we would have to work much longer and harder under these conditions to produce enough goods to enable us to maintain what we would consider even a minimally acceptable standard of living. In such a situation, the goods we need would all be unusually scarce and would command, from what our point of view, would be very high prices in terms of the hours of our labor that we would have to expend to be able to earn the money to buy them. A great many consumers chasing relatively few goods inevitably means high prices. So since the relative lack of capital equipment means a low productivity of labor, it is unavoidable that workers throughout the economy will have to toil long and hard to produce the amount of consumer goods people believe they need. Well, therefore, it would not be greedy businessmen who would be responsible for people's impoverishment under these conditions. It's greedy businessmen, so-called, who invest in the very capital equipment that increases the American output in the first place and makes goods more abundant and therefore less dear. That is the moral of this story, not wicked businessmen exploiting workers. You couldn't produce any more goods under the conditions that you had, say, in the 19th or 18th century. This is exactly the situation people faced in England during the early Industrial Revolution, and to a lesser extent, the economy in which American workers lived in the 19th century, when they were supposedly exploited by greedy businessmen. If the disaster I've just described occurred today, it is precisely to those conditions that we would revert. And those people lived through the very situation we recognize as a catastrophe. So the reason people back then could afford far fewer and considerably lower quality consumer goods than we do today involved the inability of the country's productive capacity to produce any more. Now, we take for granted in our economy our increasing ability to feed, clothe, and house more and more people over time, not to mention having an increasing life expectancy over time. Now, the typical critic of capitalism and the typical textbook expects the increased population that capitalism makes possible to enjoy right away spacious and commodious homes, fine cuisine, and ample leisure time. If they lack these things, the only explanation our critics can come up with is that greedy businessmen are wickedly depriving the workers of them. That these things might not even exist in any great numbers is not even considered. So how then have wages really been raised in the past, and how can they continue to rise in the future? Are government and labor unions the heroes of this story? Well, not even close. And here I'd like to share a worthwhile and very revealing quotation by Milton Friedman, who writes this: "When unions get higher wages for their members by restricting entry into an occupation, those higher wages are at the expense of other workers who find their opportunities reduced. When government pays its employees higher wages, those higher wages are at the expense of the taxpayer. But when workers get higher wages and better working conditions through the free market, when they get raises by firms competing with one another for the best workers, by workers competing with one another for the best jobs, those higher wages are at nobody's expense. They can come only from higher productivity, greater capital investment, more widely diffused skills. The whole pie is bigger. There's more for the worker, but there's also more for the employer, the investor, the consumer, and even the tax collector." Well, boo hiss to that last one, but you understand the drift of the passage. Well, this is how Americans' real wages have been raised. And real wages involves purchasing power. So a $10 wage in 1905 is not the same, nominal wage is not the same as a $10 wage in 2005. Nominally, they're the same, it's the same number, but in real terms, obviously, you'd be able to buy a lot more in 1905. So talking about real wages. Well, in a free market economy, businesses, what do they do with the vast bulk of their profits? They invest it in capital equipment to increase the productivity of labor. So they use steam shovels instead of regular shovels. They use typewriters rather than the labor of scribes, or word processors instead of typewriters, things like this. And therefore, their workers can produce much more. They invest in a forklift, for instance, so that people working in a warehouse can move pallets of goods much more efficiently and quickly, and they can stack them much more higher than they could possibly do with their bare hands. And that's not just a fortuitous example. My father, who's deceased now 10 years, and actually to whom my book, The Church and the Market, is dedicated, He was a forklift operator for many years. He was a blue-collar worker and was totally free market. He's one of the few people who understood that, well, investment in capital equipment benefits me, so I favor it. God love you, Dad. You know, I mean, may perpetual light shine upon you. Well, other kinds of machinery does the same sort of thing. So the amount of goods that the economy can produce is multiplied many times over, and this is how we create wealth. So now firms can create many, many times more goods at lower cost, and thanks to the pressures of market competition, these firms pass these cost cuts on to consumers in the form of lower prices and better quality merchandise. The ordinary person's standard of living increases, therefore, not because the government takes from the rich to give to him, or because labor unions struggle with employers to win him concessions. That's their favorite word. Labor historians struggle. The labor struggle for this and that. Like there's no other verb to describe this. His standard of living increases because business firms can invest in machinery that increases what he's capable of producing. It can produce more and more goods with fewer and fewer hands, and thereby increasing the amount of goods, material goods available, and making them less and less expensive. Now we can see this wonderful process at work in our everyday lives. Americans today need to work far fewer hours to earn the purchasing power necessary to buy a whole host of goods than they had to in the past. For instance, in 1950, Americans had to work 6 minutes to earn the money they would need to buy them a loaf of bread. By 1999, it was just 3.5 minutes. It took 21 minutes of labor in 1950 to be able to earn the money to buy a dozen oranges. By 1999, that was 9 minutes. For 100 kilowatts of electricity, you'd have to work for 2 hours in 1950. I mean, is it even worth it after that? I mean, you could power the thing yourself. In 1999, the same person would have had to work only 14 minutes. For a 3-minute coast-to-coast telephone call, 104 minutes of labor were required in 1950. By 1999, that was down to 2 minutes. My gosh, you would have to say a lot quickly in that phone call. Look, I worked 104 minutes just to be able to say hello to you. I hope you have a nice day. Have a nice birthday. Goodbye. That would be it. But the statistics are even more dramatic if we use the year 1900 as one of our baseline years. To buy a pair of jeans, for example, someone in 1900 would have had to work 9 hours as compared with 4 hours in 1950 and 3 hours in 1999. But how about, you're asking yourselves, how about a 3-pound chicken? He hasn't mentioned that yet. A worker in 1900 would have had to labor for 160 minutes for a 3-pound chicken. However, in 1950, that was down to 71 minutes, and in 1999, you want a 3-pound chicken, that'll be 24 minutes of labor. In 1908, wow, I'm getting an interesting reaction to that. People whistling at the 3-pound chicken, people running out to buy poultry at this point. Wonderful. It took the average American 2 years to earn the money to buy a car in 1908. Today, it costs about 8 months of labor to purchase a Ford Taurus. And as Tom DiLorenzo puts it, he says, but the car is a technological miracle compared with the cars of yesteryear, with standard air conditioning, power seats, safety devices of all kinds, cruise control, a sunroof, tinted glass, a CD player, and so on. Now, in case anybody is wondering, but aren't we going to run out of jobs, right? I mean, if we get really productive, maybe we just need 3 people and robots can do the rest, like what are we all going to do? Well, you're not going to run out of jobs. As long as human wants remain even partially unfulfilled, there is never a shortage of jobs. In some fields, like agriculture, if you increase your output because you've invested in equipment, let's say you triple the agricultural output of the United States, that does not mean that people are typically going to triple their food intake. Probably they'll keep their food intake roughly the same, so the effect will simply be that people who used to work in this field are now released and their labor can be applied to produce other goods we couldn't have had before. I've always used the example in my classes of a fictional economy. Let's imagine you have an economy of 4 people. 3 of them work at the post office. 1 of them grows carrots. Now, it's a fictional economy, you understand, although it does seem like typical government misallocation of labor that you've got 3 people working to deliver letters to the other guy, apparently. But suppose they introduce one of these stamp vending machines into the post office, and it does enough labor that they can release one of those 3 postal workers. Well, immediately you look at that and you say, well, that's a shame, he lost his job. You know, he's going to come in and start smashing the machine and be all resentful. But the point is that with that machine, they can produce the same amount of postal labor they produce with the 3 people. Now there's an extra person. He can go grow carrots with the other guy. So on net, we have more carrots. We have more production. People are more prosperous. That's not what you get, by the way, if you read The Grapes of Wrath. Okay, not a bad book, I suppose, but John Steinbeck has this one little chapter where he just goes off on a tangent talking about the mechanization of agriculture is throwing everybody out of work. Well, it makes goods more abundant, and it frees labor to produce other goods so that we can have now. But in other fields, let's say automobile manufacturing, productivity increases will create a mass market in automobiles where there hadn't been one before. And here, this will attract more employment in that case, where something that had once been a luxury now becomes an item of mass production. In either case, consumers are enormously benefited. Now, to say the least, this is not exactly the description of events that we find in a typical history text. Instead, what we find is the idea that the massive redistribution of wealth from rich to poor was morally necessary and economically indispensable in order to improve the lot of the least wealthy. Well, Professor George Reisman, who's written a great work on this, says there was a little problem with that plan. In the 19th century, let's say, there was virtually nothing to redistribute. The workers of the early 19th century did not lack automobiles and television sets because the capitalists were keeping the whole supply to themselves. There simply were no automobiles or television sets for anyone. Nor did the workers of those days lack sufficient housing, clothing, and meat because the capitalists had too much of these goods. Very little of such goods could be produced when they had to be produced almost entirely by hand. If the limited supplies of such goods that the capitalists had could have been redistributed, the improvement in the conditions of the workers would hardly have been noticeable. If one person in 1,000, say, is a wealthy capitalist and eats twice as much and has 20 times the clothing and furniture of the average person, hardly any noticeable improvement for the average person could come from dividing the capitalist's greater than average consumption by 999 and redistributing it. At the very best, a redistribution of wealth or income would have been useless as a means of alleviating the poverty of the past. So it is only through capital investment that this can come about. In fact, this type of wealth redistribution directly harms the long-term interests of the workers themselves, because in the long run, all it does is discourage businesses from investing in the first place if they know the fruits of it are simply going to be taxed away. The truth, says George Reisman, is that what made possible the rise in real wages and average standard of living over the last 200 years is precisely the fact that for the first time in history, the redistributors were beaten back long enough and far enough to make large-scale capital accumulation and innovation possible. Now, the objection is immediately raised, and here we go again back to who protects the worker. Because I will hear the objection, didn't workers in the past have to work very long hours? Well, certainly, without a doubt. And I think with my thought experiment, we've helped to account for why that was absolutely inevitable. By today's standards, certainly, people in the 19th century worked an exhausting schedule. But again, if output per worker is miserably low, then if you're going to produce enough consumer goods so you get to a level that people consider adequate, well, you're either going to have to work long hours or go without. That accounts for the low standard of living and the long hours of work that existed in the past. Now, as the productivity of labor increases, and with it the level of real wages, people can begin to opt for additional leisure rather than continue to work these long hours of the past. So without the need for any legislation at all, a situation will eventually arise in which employers find that offering correspondingly fewer hours to be in their own economic interest and will offer them without the need for government coercion. If somebody who once worked 80 hours a week now wishes to work only 60 hours, so that is to say 3/4 as many hours, and is willing to accept a wage less than 3/4 of his previous wage as a premium on the leisure he will now enjoy, then it makes perfect sense for his employer to offer these terms. Now, to the extent that maximum hours legislation corresponded with people's desire to work fewer hours, it was superfluous, since that outcome would have come about by means of this process. But to the extent that that legislation was economically premature, forcing fewer hours on workers who needed the wages of their longer hours in order to maintain what they considered an adequate standard of living, they harmed the very people they were allegedly intended to help. The same thing goes for working conditions. Now, obviously, improvements in working conditions that pay for themselves in terms of less workplace damage and disruption will, of course, be readily adopted by any profit-seeking enterprise. But even improvements that do not pay for themselves will still be adopted in cases in which the wage premium that would have to be offered to attract workers in the absence of the improvement would be higher than the cost of simply introducing the improvement. So, for example, the only non-arbitrary way of introducing an improvement like climate control in the workplace. And the only way of doing so that doesn't price workers out of jobs entirely or impoverish society out of proportion to the satisfaction derived by workers now enjoying climate control is by paying attention to the market. Now, we all know there are certain lines of work that attract a wage premium because they're so disgusting or undesirable in one way or another. Well, as time goes on, for example, as climate control becomes more widely available in workplaces, employers that are not offering climate control will find that they have to offer a wage premium that gets higher and higher to attract workers to them rather than to employers that have climate control. If you're going to make me work without it, you're going to have to pay me extra. Well, eventually, you have to pay so much extra that you just say, to heck with it, I'll just institute climate control. The market, in this way, allows for the rational allocation of resources and helps to ensure that improvements in workplace conditions do not come at the expense of other goods that workers and consumers value more. I mean, after all, there is no logical limit to how much we would want to improve workplace conditions. We would all like to have 5-hour lunch breaks, the services of a masseuse, and an office with a view of Niagara Falls. But obviously, this would be economically ludicrous. So at some point, we have to understand that there are trade-offs involved, and there is no way in isolation from market exchange that these alternatives can be compared rationally. So this is why taxes on business and capital are so foolish and counterproductive. But of course, they are exactly what is called for routinely by politicians, by historians, and I very much regret to say, by religious spokesmen all too often. I add that with great regret. They spend their time condemning not the taxes that inhibit investment and hold back American prosperity, but rather the alleged wickedness of businessmen and the wealthy. Taxation, according to them, is a righteous method for redistributing the supposedly ill-gotten gains of the wealthy to the oppressed poor. Incidentally, it so happens that the condition of the poorest is consistently far higher in market societies around the world than in heavily interventionist ones that have substantial wealth redistribution. So even on those grounds alone, even if you're going to accept the premise of John Rawls that we should want a society, he's got some caveats to this, but a society in which the well-being of the poor is maximized to the degree possible, well, then you should want a market society. That is the Rawlsian solution, it turns out. That's not the solution that he wanted, but that is the solution, as the data from around the world amply reveals. Well, these are the types of points, I've elaborated on them to some degree, because some of this is from George Reisman and my own elaborations, but these are the fundamental insights of somebody like Milton Friedman, that in cases in which it seems overwhelming that government intervention is required, it just seems like common sense. Well, naturally, without this, everyone would be suffering or dead, no one would be alive anymore. We have all these kind of crazy worst-case scenarios that are thrown at us. Friedman was somebody who, in a great many cases, was not afraid to say the exact opposite and to back that up with extremely rigorous argument. Now, the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, which has done such fine work educating religious leaders in economics, has begun using the slogan, "Good intentions are not enough." And indeed, they are not. Concern for the worker is entirely legitimate, says Father James Sadowski, S.J., but concern can accomplish little unless we know the causes and the cures for the disease. Now, incidentally, I inserted S.J. there because there aren't a whole lot of Jesuits of my acquaintance who are sympathetic to the free market that I've come across. Father Sadowski is one of them, so I like to put in that S.J. so everybody knows he's a Jesuit, just to drive people crazy. So Father Sadowski makes this important point, that how are we going to help people if we don't know what the cure is for what ails them? Milton Friedman, over the course of an extraordinarily productive career, has left us a corpus of work that in many areas goes a very long way toward diagnosing our economic ills and prescribing remedies that promote both human freedom and human flourishing. And for that, anyone who truly cares about human welfare remains very much in his debt. Thank you. So, Chad, how are things going here?
Well, we have time for about 3 questions.
3 questions. Okay. Chad, do you have a question?
I do not.
You want to come up to people coming up to the microphone? Okay. By the way, my website is thomasewoods.com. While we're waiting, you can all go check that out. I'm so vain; it's unbelievable. Normally, I'm not. I'm a pleasant. Let's just get to the questions. Let's get to the questions. Yes, sir?
My name is Gresham. I'm from Notre Dame. We've been having this, some student activists have been proposing a living wage for the employees on campus. I recently heard a liberal economics professor say that if you increase the wage, that's not going to price laborers out of the market because the university is already underpaying, the employees. So I just wanted to get your thoughts. I mean, I've always thought it was common economic sense that if you increase the wages, you're going to price laborers out of the market.
Yeah.
But
well, I mean, it is possible. Yeah, the question. We have microphones. So people heard the question. Okay. It is possible. Sometimes we don't have the microphones. It is possible that once in a while an employer may actually be paying a wage that is below sort of the prevailing one in that field. And so that a strike in that case, even Henry Hazlitt, who was a big free marketeer in Economics in One Lesson, even said that a strike can serve the salutary purpose of alerting the employer that, look, you are offering a wage that is simply not acceptable, and particularly if he can't find anyone to replace these people. But if they went on strike and other people said, well, look, maybe you won't work for this wage, but I need to support my family somehow, and I'd like to work for it, well, then that would suggest to me that the wage is not too low. So, I mean, there's no, in isolation from, knowing what other people would do if they had this wage offered to them, it's not really easy to know what the exact answer is. But typically, in general, this type of legislation will, we will see some people whose wages will go up, and that's what is seen. But what is not seen are the people who either lose their jobs or whatever, and they don't lose their jobs right away, and it's not obvious that's why they lost them. And this is why these types of policies are so pernicious, because you can see the beneficiaries very clear. They're earmarked. But the people who suffer are not earmarked. They're just anonymous people who just suffer, and nobody really knows why they lost their jobs. And then the process repeats itself. So my thinking would be that if you want to increase real wages, you got to do this stuff. It's absolutely unavoidable. Thank you.
Hi. I think you've demonstrated pretty well how the idea that Karl Marx proposed in Das Kapital, that competition and investment in capital basically hurts the labor because now he gets less wages, or all the money that should be going to him is going to invest in capital. You said, well, no, actually, it's making it easier for him to live.
Right.
What would you say, though, is maybe the religious viewpoint for a capital owner? Okay, yes, we know free market's going to take care of getting increasing employees' wages, but would you go so far as to say there's a more Christian way to operate a business so that you don't simply do the free market thing and invest? Right. And would you say? Yeah,
that's an excellent question. I mean, it's one I get a lot because it's perfectly legitimate. I mean, I guess my answer is that in your capacity as a human being, I mean, you have an absolute moral obligation to be charitable. So if you're a human being who happens to be a business owner, then you have one of your employees is suffering in some way, and you're in a position to be able to help that person, then it is most admirable of you to help that person. But the only concern I have is that it's difficult to extrapolate from individual cases like this to a general policy. Because, for instance, in the early years of the Great Depression, in fact, in 1929 itself, President Hoover convened a meeting of business executives at the White House and said, I want you to keep wages up throughout this potential downturn. Things weren't terrible in 29. They didn't get bad for about another year or so. But I want you to keep wages where they are, and certainly don't cut them. And a lot of people argue that this was a very, very humane policy, because wouldn't it be unchristian at a time of general downturn to cut people's wages? You should keep them up. But the effects of this, as Richard Vedder and Lowell Galloway have shown in their indispensable book called Out of Work: Unemployment and Government in the 20th Century, something like that, but Out of Work is the title. They've shown that actually this type of thinking, well, what it did was it contributed to the massive unemployment of people. In fact, when Franklin Roosevelt basically made this high wage policy, in effect the law of the land with the National Industrial Recovery Act, there were some people during the Great Depression who had very high wages, did very well during the Great Depression. People bought a lot more refrigerators when there was 25% unemployment than when there was 3% unemployment. But that's just odd, you know. So while it's one of these cases where the employer has to know in a case-by-case basis what he can do and what he can't do. And if he is in a position to help somebody, he should help him. But it's very hard to extrapolate that to a general policy, because then you wind up with a one-size-fits-all thing that in the long run does not benefit people. Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Nancy Boone from Indiana Wesleyan University. I also adhere to the Austrian Economic School of Thought. Wanted to ask you, how do you, as a Catholic and as an Austrian economist, respond to those who, in reference to Paul's letter to Timothy in the New Testament, say that we should unquestioningly submit to the government, even though many of its interventionary policies do more harm than good, believing that this is the will of God?
Well, that is a good question. I mean, inevitably, well, I mean, and it's not even just that verse. I mean, there's St. Paul says that, you know, the powers that be are of God and they're established for our, you know, for our good and everything. Yeah, that's a verse that a lot of people have reckoned with over the years, and one of the answers that's been given, well, first of all, just note that let's say the times of the Roman Empire, when the Christians were being persecuted, what is very interesting is that we do not see a theory of civil disobedience developing at that time. People submitted to what was in store for them. And so that would be a very, very strict Pauline reading. But then, as time goes on, you do begin to see serious Christian thinkers beginning to spin rationale, saying that, well, you know, obviously the rule of the ruler, it can't be absolute. I mean, God has his laws that can't be contravened, and so you get, particularly the late scholastics in 16th century Spain, go so far as to, like Juan de Mariana, argue that it is morally licit at times to kill the king, and you know, Mariana was read the Bible, so in other words, you know, one way of answering this is to say that, I mean, biblical exegesis is a difficult thing to do in a matter of 30 seconds. But that in the matter of when you look at the entirety of Christian tradition, when you look at how Christian thinkers over the years have reckoned with this, and you've seen that there has been a development in the way they've conceived of this, of what exactly, to what degree are we obligated to submit to the authorities. That has developed as time has passed, and even beyond that, it may be one thing to say you must submit to the authorities, you know, as a general abstract principle, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to like it, or you're not allowed to complain about these particular policies, or you can't vocally advocate that they should be overturned. I mean, the same thing with the Pope, for instance, if you're a Catholic. I mean, you can't really go overthrow the Pope. You can't just overturn his legislation, but you can pray that it would be changed, and you can advocate and respectfully call for reconsidering of it, and that's at least what Christians can do.
Thank you.
Okay, Chad, we're done?
We're done, Dr. Woods. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen.